problem. Okay, so when I started looking into the literature around the economic project of the far right, I felt a little bit unsatisfied by the situation that you kind of have two big camps of scholars that say kind of contradictory things. On the one hand, we have now a relatively large literature that says the far right project is a resistance project against neoliberalism, globalization and technocracy, and it's part of a Polanyian double movement with which I have a problem in general. Now we'll get to that later. And a loud proponent of this is Wolfgang Streeck, but Chantal Mouffe makes also a similar argument. So that's kind of the one side. This is a project that's raging against neoliberalism. But then we have a second body of literature that's growing that says actually the far right economic policies are an extension of neoliberalism, actually grow out of neoliberalism, Quinn Slobodian would argue. And Ian Brough makes similar arguments. This is a authoritarian neoliberalism. So we end up with two versions of, well, I think quite contradictory interpretations of what this project is. And if you look into media comments about the far right, that is reflected as well. The far right project is viewed as messy, erratic. The Guardian calls Giorgia Meloni a shapeshifter. The BBC, AFD, inconsistent, and Adam Tooze warns of a sane washing of Trump's economic policy program. And what I understand, and I think, I kind of set up a database of financial policy programs of the far right, so I understand it is messy, but it's also unsatisfactory to just say, well, we don't know what the project is. And yeah, this is what this study intends to do. I want to conceptualize what the far right financial project is. And I think that just because our contemporary concepts of economic policy do not neatly fit the far right agenda does not mean that we cannot discern a distinct ideological project of the far right. And I will be focusing on financial policies because I set up a database, as I mentioned, and my sense was I had to focus on something and not kind of look at the whole project, and that might actually also be part of the problem of the lack of clarity of what it is. So in this presentation, I will have two goals. One is to figure out what the larger project of the overarching approach of far-right economic policy is. And second, once I get into the data, I will show that actually there are considerable differences in how they envision financial policy. And that might actually account for some of the confusion that we see in the media and in scholarship. It depends on who they are looking at, if it's viewed as neoliberal or not. So the state of the art around the far-right economic project tells us that this arises mostly out of a failure of establishment parties to generate economic growth. Hopkin and Blythe talk about the result of the previous regime, so the one that we're still in, but that is possibly being replaced by something new, results out of a creditor's paradise, which is characterized by austerity, high interest rates, and central bank independence. If you have these three pillars in place that are kind of supporting this creditor's paradise, you will have problems of generating economic growth, and you will have problems of generating public goods without harming economic growth itself. So if you don't have economic growth and or social securities, voters will flock to the far-right parties in the hope that they can revive both of these. Well, this is, I think, really useful, and I believe that economic growth is an important element. The literature is really focused on the previous regime and the reason why voters flock to these parties, but they have very little to say about the far-right project itself. So what are the economic policies we're looking at? And I felt like that was kind of the gap that I could step into. So what are the economic policy strategies the far right develops to resolve the problem that the previous regime was struggling with or generated? So here I'm doing something, I don't know, possibly very contentious, but it seemed really intuitive to me. If I don't understand what the project is about, how I can conceptualize it, why not go to the conceptualization of the 1920s and 1930s policies of the fascist regimes. And so what I learned by reading Polanyi more closely, first of all, is that this is a regime that is supposed to be saving capitalism. And that doesn't mean that it has to go along with neoliberalism. It's about saving capitalism. So it's can be a different strategy. Those are two different things. Karl Polanyi argues that the fascist project is one that is offering a solution to a deadlock between the capitalist and democratic tendencies. So voters want more state interventionism, businesses want less state interventionism. If this is then coupled with an economic slump, you can't achieve either of those. And the fascist solution is to save capitalism at the expense of democracy. So if these two are clashing, the fascists are supporting capitalism. And I do not see this represented in the literature right now. And especially with this idea that the far right is part of the counter movement, that's not what Polanyi said. It's a project to save capitalism. So I then continued and I read Giovanni Arrighi, and he adds a second element to the way I'm thinking about this right now, which is that the far right project, or the fascist project in his case, is a project of securing a certain share of the global economy for your domestic economy. So in the 1920s and 1930s, what they experienced is the breakdown of the 19th century liberal world order and low economic growth, which trigger distributive struggles in the global sphere. And what the fascist project is basically to improve the position of the economy in the world economy at the expense of others. If the pie gets smaller, how can I make sure that I can still get my share, and I mean, in effect, actually a larger share, so I can retain or improve the income situation or living standards in my economies. Arrighi then tells us very explicitly what the economic strategies are. And of course, the 1920s and 1930s strategies are different from what we're seeing right now, but he gives me a conceptualization of the larger project, which is one in which fascists take bureaucratic control over the process of accumulation. That is how he sees the essence of the project. It's a willingness of using the power of the state, but it doesn't have to mean that this involves massive state interventionism or regulation of the financial sphere. It's about control. It uses aggressive rent extraction in the domestic or international economic spheres to end the phase of persistently low economic growth, and to strengthen the economy's position in the global capitalist system. It's about concentration of productive resources in the national sphere. So as I mentioned, that's kind of the larger conceptualization that I now have in mind. But as I mentioned, and I will get into my data in a second, I actually find considerable differences between the financial policy regimes. And I again rely on Giovanni Arrighi to make sense of these differences. So he argues that if this is a struggle over resources in the global system, then your economy's position in the global system will matter in terms of what you can do to pursue your project of expansion. So it depends on the economic resources that you have available and possibly the state capacity that will enable you to expand. And I started thinking about how our financial system is composed at the moment, and I'm relying here on Ben Brown's idea that this is an asset manager capitalism, at least since the global financial crisis, which entails a shift from banks to institutional capital pools. So mutual funds, hedge funds, private equity, venture capital become more important in the system. And they make new areas of economic activity accessible for financial investment. So venture capital firms groom startup companies. Private equity firms turn companies, housing, infrastructure, and farmland into asset classes accessible to institutional capital pools. If you combine this with Arrighi, you basically have to start thinking about where in the global food chain are you of the asset manager capitalism. Do you have some of these firms that are extracting from abroad, extracting resources abroad, so private equity buying up companies in France and Greece and Italy, or do you actually have them, well, the other way around? Are they sitting inside of your economy, so UK, US, Switzerland, or are they buying up your companies, so France, Italy, and Greece? And so that's one of the distinctions that I'm making. And the second element that I've been thinking about is, what is your capacity to deal with sovereign debt in the international realm, because that's really important for Italy, France, and Greece. So now we're getting into the data. I've been setting up a financial policy database, and it's currently comprised of 9 countries: the US, UK, Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany, Austria, France, Italy, and Greece. I picked these because I wanted to have them represent different growth models, different varieties of capitalism, different welfare regimes, to make sure that I'm not just kind of capturing something that is just quite similar because they are institutionally set up similarly. I excluded Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Spain because they basically, the parties, the far-right parties in these countries do not talk about finance almost at all. Which is interesting in and of itself, but how do you analyze something that's not there? So I kind of decided they had to, I had to remove them from the project. I'm looking at, well, which parties am I looking at? I picked parties that are categorized as populist and far-right in the existing literature. And I picked, if there were more than one far-right party, the one that's currently most successful, because I wanted it to be consistent and not kind of falling apart into different pieces. In terms of the time frame, I tried to cover the past 10 years, so I can establish some type of consistency in their policy orientation. And I, as of now, have about 40 sources per country, so 360 in total. And those are both English language sources and native language sources, which I translated through Google Translate. The sources I used are party manifestos, videos, social media, public statements by the party members, newspaper articles to get a little bit of an external interpretation of what they want, policy initiatives, policy positions in parliament, both by governing parties or opposition parties, and business statements to get an idea of whether or not certain financial subsectors feel supported by this actor or not. The big problem, of course, also with, I demonstrated with how I started this talk, is, of course, the question: how do you make sure that what you're reading is actually the truth and that they actually mean it? Especially if they say something in the morning that's completely different from what they are saying in the evening. And I rely on the international relations literature that use a methodology or a method of intent inference, to ensure that what they read, that policymakers say about something is actually what they mean. And they use two elements in this, or two elements I found useful. Inductive inference, which is basically a track record, how many times, or is this consistent over time, what they are saying. And the second one I find more useful even is behavioral consistency. So do their actions match their words? And I did this in looking at statements that they made and then comparing it with the policy initiatives that they followed. As either governing or opposition parties, you can already tell that in Parliament, even if they are opposition parties, the tone changes. It becomes much less radical. Sometimes the initiatives sound very different from what they say in public. And so it's really useful to kind of double check what do they actually want. And Parliament seems to be a sphere where they are a little bit, I mean, it's a bit surprising, but they seem to feel a little bit safer to say what they are actually pursuing. Just an example of how I did this. So Trump consistently supports the private equity market, but then he also says things like he wants to close the carried interest tax loophole, which is basically going to hurt private equity. But since he consistently supports private equity in policy initiatives, I basically dismissed the statement that he's making about the loopholes. Yeah? So it's kind of it looks to me like this is an outwardly focusing claim that he's making. He may not implement it, and once he does, it has more weight for me, basically. So this is the data, and you don't have to read anything here. I just want to show you what I did physically. So it's very low-key, a Excel table that I filled with data. So on the left-hand side, you can see the policy initiatives. And then I tried to fill in for each of the countries whether or not the far-right party is supportive of this or is actually not supportive of it. And then I added to each of these data points a note, and you can see that at the bottom, where I collected all the evidence that I have collected. The idea is that once I publish this, I can actually put this online and people can double check, oh, this was her reasoning. So they said this 3 times and implemented it twice, and so we believe this is actually accurate. So here is an overview of the regimes that I will get into in more detail in a minute. But it helps us to make sense of the differences and how they approach finance. And I'm coming up with 3 different groups of countries. So the first one I call credit market cyclists. And the core group is composed of Italy and Greece. And France is in the group, but it's sometimes also in the second group, which I call it capital market cyclists. The core group is made out of Germany and Austria. The Netherlands fall into this group, but the Netherlands also sometimes fall into the third group, which are asset manager capitalists, and they are at the core comprised of the US, the UK, and Switzerland. So these 3 groups we will now be looking at. We can see that they have different responses to different initiatives in financial markets. And some of them are less surprising and some are more surprising. So the first one, support for asset managers, hedge funds, and private equity, unsurprising, or less surprising, I would say, that the credit market cyclists do not support this area of finance. The capital market cyclists sometimes. The asset manager globalists obviously are supportive of this. Now, and I think this is really fascinating, shield domestic markets from takeovers, shareholder influence, or foreign investor influence. Unsurprising, credit market cyclists do want to shield their markets from the international financial market. But also the capital market cyclists want to protect their financial markets from outside influence. The asset manager globalists, no, they are very much in favor of liberalizing and integrating. The next category, financial market regulation, yes for the first group, no for the other two groups. And then the last category, state-led credit, so the state being kind of one of the orchestrator of where credit is supposed to flow, yes in the first category and no in the other two. This is basically just to give you a feel for there are considerable differences in these regimes, and I find these the most striking ones. So finally, I will now walk you through the three regimes and will give you some evidence of individual countries and what the specific initiatives in these countries are. So let's start with the credit market cyclists. So at the core, Italy and Greece. France is sometimes in this category. And of course, we can talk about in a second how much sense it makes if I say they are sometimes in and sometimes out, but that's a little bit the complication, I think, of this project. So these actors attempt to control the domestic credit market to revive industry and sovereign budget resources. They want to cycle savings through domestic credit into the economy. Yeah, so savings into banks and then into industry. That's kind of the cycle that they have in mind. And the state is part of that cycle as well. They want to shield national assets. So Marine Le Pen, for instance, pursues an economic security authority. She wants to protect emerging French sectors and defend the French economic diversity through such an institution. These actors also want to limit financial speculation, so they often talk about separating retail and investment banking, or to implement a tax on banks' windfall profits. Banks and credit are central in this regime. Marine Le Pen argues the role that banks play in the economic system is strategic and an instrument of recovery guided by the state. So they, for instance, want to use state investment banks like the German KfW to revive industry. And I think this is very interesting, they want to institute specific control over banks, and the Italian case is where we can see this most visibly. So Giorgia Meloni supported a merger between two banks, one of which is partially government-owned, to build a new center of financial power that sits next to the international banks, which are basically, in her view, channeling savings abroad instead of investing them in Italy. So if we can get control of the banks, we can make sure that they invest in Italy and that they also buy government bonds. So it kind of has this dual strategy. How can we finance the state through getting control of the banks, and how can we get investments into the Italian economy? And they also want to reward shareholders who invest long-term. So again, this is Italy, want to give an incentive to hold shares for 10 years. And this favors family-backed Italian investors that seek to retain control of companies. They also want to limit the power of international banks. So UniCredit is viewed as a foreign bank. Instead of saying, well, we have this international bank and we can use it, Meloni really thinks that these actors are deeply problematic for the Italian economy. They basically channel savings abroad, and again, the government debt problem is one, so they are worried they are not buying enough government debt. The idea is to get savers into buying government debt. So again, that's kind of the cycle. if savers buy government debt, then we can all do it domestically, and we can shield ourselves from international financial markets. The second category, the capital market cyclers. So that's Germany and Austria at the core, and the Netherlands sometimes pops up here as well. But the Dutch are a little bit more liberal even than these ones are. But they are much more liberal or liberalizing, deregulating than the first category. So they want to build a strong domestic capital market. I think this is so interesting, by channeling savings into domestic equities. And they are more market friendly than the first category. So they want less state involvement. So free markets, but shielded from international financial markets. So they want to protect domestic companies from takeovers by foreign firms. So only minority stakes should be possible. The Austrian Freedom Party argues, for instance, foreign investors should not go on a shopping spree in domestic stock corporations. They want to limit shareholder influence. So this is the Dutch PVV. They want to give company boards more time to assess a takeover or a significant adjustment to the strategy proposed by shareholders. They want to limit the drive of shareholders, which caused the financial crisis. And the AfD and the FPÖ are both against the capital markets union, which is fascinating because you would think, well, you know, they can still use it, but they want to protect their economies from the international sphere. The idea is to channel savings into domestic capital markets. So if you let savers and pensioners invest in ETFs and funds, then they are supposed to get a tax incentive to invest into German or Austrian firms, not outside of Germany or Austria. The AfD argues so that many of our German companies are no longer in the hands of American investment companies or Saudi oil billionaires, but in the hands of the German people. They are also supportive of funds for venture capital, and are not in favor of extensive financial regulation, because financial regulation would curtail that cycle that they have in mind. And finally, the asset manager globalists. So this is the most liberal model, economically liberal model. They support private equity, hedge funds, venture capital funds, asset managers. And the goal is, if I understand this correctly, to extract resources domestically, but predominantly abroad. So let's first look at financial market regulation. Obviously, they want to liberalize and deregulate as much as possible. So liberate financial actors from international and European financial market regulation. Get rid of the Basel Endgame 3 capital requirements for large lenders, against which big banks had lobbied fiercely. In Switzerland, when the Credit Suisse went under in 2023, the SBP proposed to break up large banks. So you often have that rhetoric of we're against financial markets or international financial capital. But then in 2024, they withdraw the proposal and argue regulatory projects in the area of banking and asset management are enormous. They overburden our financial service providers. This party also rejects the financial service framework agreement with the EU and new capital rules for UBS. We have done nothing for UBS and the Swiss Financial Center if investors turn away. There's also not much enthusiasm for banking regulation, so they want to remove the strict rules of the Dodd-Frank Act. The idea in this area of Trump is to incite a flurry of mergers of banks to concentrate capital, I think. And concentration of capital pops up in other areas as well. They want to generally facilitate takeovers and acquisitions in the US, enable major deals which were hampered under Biden under high interest rates and antitrust rules. But the biggest chunk that I find most interesting, and that's most kind of fits most into that larger narrative of where you are in the food chain of global asset management, is that there seems to be an idea that they can extract rents abroad. So Trump restricted the Volcker rule, which now banks can invest deposits into hedge funds and private equity funds, which they couldn't do as long as this was still in place. He pursues low interest rates for international takeovers and acquisitions. That's where the attack on the Federal Reserve seems to come from. So there's a kind of an interest in limiting central bank independence to bring interest rates down. And Trump revamped the tax system in a way that enables private equity to bring earnings back to the US. And so they can be taxed, or at least they are back in the US. So they reduced taxes on the repatriation of earnings and implemented a territorial tax system in 2017, which makes the income of earnings by foreign subsidiaries tax exempt. And so private equity was very excited about that. Private equity is also excited about low interest rates, which support the stock market. And yeah, this is a model where we see relatively, well, the state is not interventionist, so this, we would probably categorize this as neoliberal, but you have strong state control. Yeah? Bureaucratic control is there. They explicitly remove the power of financial regulation agencies, the Federal Reserve, and put it in the hands of the executive. So the state, at least the executive, becomes more powerful in this sphere. And I will close here. So this project tries to make sense of what we are looking at if we are looking at the far-right economic project. Is it neoliberal or interventionist? And my argument is we kind of have to go beyond the existing concepts of economic policymaking if we want to understand it. This is a new project altogether, but I also showed that it's not so new. We've seen elements of it before, even though they were also different. So it is a new project. And it's one of taking bureaucratic control over the process of accumulation. This must not be interventionist. And it might look differently in different countries, depending on the economy's position in the international financial system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inga, for, I'm sure everyone will agree, it was a very interesting, provocative presentation. We'll start with specific questions and then invite comments and so on. The first specific question should, using my chair's prerogative, come from me. Have you looked, Inga,
Should use it on the third round.
at the question